A modern review that will be launching later this year, or early next year, will aim, in Moliere's phrase, to entertain and edify. It will be a digital and print publication that will simultaneously be published in the UK and India as Britain's global magazine. We hope to introduce new voices in India to global readership and become Britain's voice in India and India's voice in Britain. After much arduous work that lasted several months, I'm delighted to say that we've been able to trademark the name. When the magazine comes out, we hope you'll be among its first subscribers. Now let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a leading Indian politician, a member of the Lok Sabha for the Congress Party. Before he entered Indian politics, Dr. Tharoor was a high-ranking diplomat at the UN. In 2007, he was India's candidate for Secretary General of the UN and came a close second to Ban Ki-moon. In between, Dr. Tharoor has written 23 books, including fiction and non-fiction, which are top bestseller lists and received numerous prizes. His most recent book is The Struggle for India's Soul. His books will be available for purchase after the talk, and Dr. Tharoor, I'm sure, will be delighted to sign them. We're honoured to welcome you, Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Dr. Tharoor will be in conversation with Kapil Komireddi. Kapil is an essayist and journalist who's written from a dozen countries, including the conflict zones of Syria. I got to know him when I was editing a previous magazine, The Critic, and he was our sort of main interviewer, standout essayist, polemicist, and managed to secure interviews which we thought were extraordinary for a start-up title. Most recently, he's interviewed Marine Le Pen, which appeared on the cover of The Spectator. This is just before the election in France. His works have appeared in most major Western publications, including The Economist, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Spectator, and The Mail. In his first book, Malevolent Republic, A Short History of the New India, was published to critical acclaim in 2020 in the UK, South Asia, and North America. This unsparing polemical history of India and the rise of Modi prompted The Spectator to describe him as the B.S. Naipaul of our generation. We hope you enjoy the talk. There'll be time for questions and answers, and I'll hand over to the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael. Can we begin by giving a round of applause also to Shashi's sister, Smitha, who's been really wonderful in helping us organise this talk. Thank you, Smitha. I wanted to begin this conversation, Shashi, by giving people an idea of your life. You were born in 1956 in London.
In London.
A year later, your family moved to India. In 1978, you travelled to the United States. Sorry, you obtained a PhD.
In 75, I travelled to America.
75, you travelled to America. 78, you were the youngest person in the history of Fletcher to receive a PhD. And then you joined the United Nations, where you spent a quarter of a century.
Almost 29 years.
Yep, and you came a close second to Ban Ki-moon. You were involved in the negotiations to end hostilities in the former Yugoslavia. You managed one of the most complex refugee crises, and you very nearly succeeded Kofi Annan. If there's a global government, you were effectively its vice president, right? And then you, in between, managed to write several books. You won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. And after your career at the United Nations, you moved into the private sector. You were offered many sinecures at various universities. You turned them down. You moved to the private sector. And then after the private sector stint, you moved into popular politics, even though you were invited to join the upper house. You turned that down and you thrust yourself into the electoral politics. And you won 3 terms from a communist redoubt in Thiruvananthapuram. I just wanted to ask you, after doing all of this, after all this achievement, not to put too fine a point on it, but does it piss you off that you are a backbencher and have to take instructions from Rahul Gandhi?
No softball questions to start with here. He did seem to be sort of leading up to something biographical. Well, technically, I'm sort of a middle bencher. I'm in terms of seniority within the Congress MPs, I'm not that far back. But nonetheless, having said that, I take your point, and all I'll say is, them's the bricks. pursue the opportunities that you get, and you do your best. And I'm proud to say that I've enjoyed the opportunities I have been given. I believe I've fulfilled them to the best of my responsibility and the best of my ability. Beyond that, I can't say a hell of a lot, but I'm not going around looking pissed off, I hope.
You were a diplomat for 3 decades, and the answer radiates your capacity for diplomacy. I ask you that question because you say, I hope I've fulfilled my duties to the best of my abilities. India is on the verge of becoming, for lack of a better phrase, a Hindu Pakistan. It is on the verge of ceasing to be what its founding personalities, one of whom you wrote about in a brilliant biography, built. At this moment of existential crisis, there is one other pan-national party, the Congress Party, that is potentially in a position to save India. And the reason it's not saving India is because it's in the hands of one dynasty. You are the only leader in that party with a national profile. You are an effective manager. You ran one of the most, perhaps the most complex bureaucracy in the world. Why are you not allowed to rise in that party?
First of all, if it's a question of not being allowed to do something, you have to ask those whom you accuse of not allowing me. So it's not fair to ask me. Look, I mean, the fact is the party, most political parties in India, arguably pretty much all political parties in India, have a style of functioning that would strike, I think, many parliamentary democracies as odd, in the sense that we have, and when I came into Indian politics, having, for example, spent the previous 18 years in America, with the United Nations, yes, but watching American politics up close, it was a system which in some ways did surprise me. But I told myself, you're coming into the system as it exists, not as you might like it to be, so you play with the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are that in our system, for example, constituency parties don't elect the person to represent the party. The choice is always made by what is unfortunately called the high command, that is the headquarters of the party. An astonishing number of India's parties, both national and regional parties, are actually run by what, for lack of a better word, one might call a dynast. And that's the way the system is. It's simply the system one found when one came. There has been one sort of rebellion against the system in the attempt to establish something different, and that's the Aam Aadmi Party, or AAP, which now runs Delhi. It rose to public attention and indeed to office on the backs of a sort of very Gandhian anti-corruption movement, which was in itself a phenomenon. And that movement has subsequently fizzled out, and there's a lot of disappointment with the fact that nothing that it proclaimed it wanted to do has changed in any significant way the country for the better. But the one thing that happened was that Aam Aadmi Party, coming with the leader having the visibility that came out of that, has got elected. Can there be another such phenomenon of somebody who is from not a classically political background, seeking to establish something different? Given the size of India, it can at best happen at the state level. To create a national party is going to be a long-term endeavor. In the case of the Aam Aadmi Party, Mr. Kejriwal was young enough that he can look forward now. He's won a second state, Punjab, in the most recent elections, and that was 6 years after he won his first state, and it may take him several more years to hope to aspire to win a third state, but he can gradually spread. But even then, whether he can be a truly national party in the way the Congress is frankly difficult to hazard a guess, but if one had to, one would say probably not in his lifetime. It's just that the scale of ambition required, the organization, the resources, the money, very frankly, in a country the size of India makes that somewhat unlikely. So you're looking at a situation in which a series of dynastic parties, headed by people who have in many cases succeeded their fathers or uncles or whatever in that particular position, are battling it out for national prominence. Most of them are now essentially confined to one state. They may have started off with pretensions to being national parties, but if you say, take the Samajwadi Party, which is the Socialist Party, it is essentially a party of one state, Uttar Pradesh. If you take another break-off of the Socialist Party, the RJD, the Rashtriya Janata Dal, that is essentially confined to Bihar. If you take Mamata Banerjee's Trinamool Congress, that is essentially Bengal. Patnaik's Biju Janata Dal, that's again Orissa. The DMK, Tamil Nadu, and Pondicherry, which is an enclave really within Tamil Nadu. And so it goes. Now, Sharad Pawar's Nationalist Congress Party was meant to be a national party. It's now essentially limited to Maharashtra. And so it goes. So the one party that has an opposition presence, a history, a legacy, a university recognized party symbol, all of that, is the Congress. And the Congress, therefore, represents, for people like myself who would be broadly sort of centrist on economic matters and liberal to left on social matters, it's literally the only party one can credibly associate oneself with. And so I did. As some of you know, and I know you've read some of my earlier work, I was a staunch critic of the Congress Party right up to the liberalization in 1991. I felt it was too statist in its approach, and in my student days was a sympathizer of a party called the Swatantra Party, which was a classic liberal party with values and principles I was very happy to endorse, but which folded in 1974, in fact, in my final year of university, and I had to lament the fact that there wasn't an equivalent option available anywhere in the country. But when Congress went in for liberalization and began opposing the overt Hindutva of the BJP, I thought it would be the party to back, and that's why I support it. So ultimately, Kapil, your question raises some counter questions. Number one, why is one in a political party? Because it's a vehicle to advance one's beliefs and convictions on the national platform. Second, it stands for certain values and principles that are congruent with one's own. And third, it has a credible opportunity of making an impact on the national stage. Now, at the moment, you can sort of raise questions about all of this, but the objective answer I would give you is the only party that really ticks all those boxes for me would be the Congress Party. My convictions are by and large the same as the parties. There would be areas in which emphasis would be different. I was amused when you said Hindu Pakistan, because when I used that phrase, which was actually coined first by Jawaharlal Nehru, I found myself, to my astonishment, being repudiated by my own party spokesman. So, the party has come a long way in the wrong direction, in my view, on some of these things. But anyway, I have got convictions that are there. The party is a national vehicle, so I contest for it in the south, and it's got a presence in the north, and the east, and northwest.
Yes, I think
that's why I'm there.
Do you feel, number three, you said you made 3 points about the party, and the third point was that it's the most credible opposition. Do you feel that this is a credible opposition? Do you feel that the party exists to win elections or to provide subsistence to one family? And I ask this question again because in the past 3 years, India has witnessed persecution of Muslims, the CAA, it's witnessed the COVID second wave horror show. But the one instance in which the party leadership has mobilized the troops is when Rahul Gandhi was called to the Enforcement Directorate. It called every member of the party, bussed in troops, asked them to follow Rahul Gandhi to the Enforcement Directorate. Do you feel this party really reflects the legacy of India's freedom fighters? When Mahatma Gandhi sailed back from South Africa in 1914, the British were raising a new capital. They thought that the British Raj was going to last for 1,000 years. Gandhi didn't say, this is how things have always been in India, this is how things will always be. He reformed the Congress Party. Why doesn't your party currently reform itself? Why doesn't it purge the dynasty? It wasn't always so. In 1975, there were 14 political parties, major political parties. None of them was run by a dynasty. It's the Congress that instituted the system of dynastic rule. Why didn't you get rid of it?
Okay, first of all, Mahatma Gandhi, when he came in 1916, was already a Mahatma. He wasn't a mere mortal, and he came in to a party actually suddenly starved of leaders. Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Lokmanya Tilak were the two big leaders at the time. One died, the other was sent off, transported to jail in Myanmar, and suddenly there was a vacuum in the leadership which Gandhi was able to fill brilliantly. So there were circumstances, number one. Number two, that was a different Congress party. It had annual sessions of the AICC. Today we've had one session in the last 10 years. Second, it changed its president every year. We haven't changed our president in 20 years. So, I mean, or rather, we've changed once, but the person who was picked
Was the son, and then the mother's
and
now
then,
back.
and then he,
Yeah.
he resigned. We went back.
Yeah.
So it is a different party, it's a different era, and I think it'll be facile to go back and compare to something that happened 100 years ago, when the standards expected of political parties were also different. In some ways, were higher and better than perhaps they are today, but that's the way it is. Now, if you say, why don't we sort of stand up and change it? One of the big challenges in the way things are being done, and this is not only true of the Congress, but it's true of all the other parties I mentioned in answering the previous question, is that there is no formal mechanism for renewal within a party, other than an annual party Congress, which, as I said, does not take place annually. And that party Congress consists of delegates who have been handpicked by the very leadership you wish to challenge. So in other words, the mechanism is that if you look at Indian politics for the last several years, when people reach a level of frustration, such as clearly if you were a congressman you are clearly feeling, then you would essentially either try and split the party or go off and join another party or start another party. But you would not really find an escape valve on the top of that pressure cooker to be able to change your party from within. And that's the sad reality. Now, people might say, oh, that's very pusillanimous or whatever. It's also very realistic. Don't forget there are people with far, far longer experience in Indian politics than me, some of whom have been very overtly unhappy and frustrated, and who have found they had no other options but to either bide their time, to sulk, or to quit. And those are the options that I'm, at the moment, not choosing to exercise. I'm not a sulker by nature, and I'm not planning to quit, at least immediately. Let's put it that way. I really need to be pushed.
I'll ask you one last question on this.
Let's talk about other things.
I will move on to other things, but it's important because, you know, if Modi wins the next election in 2 years' time, India, as we know it, is finished. And it seems extraordinary to me that the Congress party's high command is not interested in reform at all. It doesn't have a full-time leader. And you're shackled to the backbenchers. You're not even allowed to become the leader of the party in the Lok Sabha. That strikes me as quite extraordinary and sad and depressing and bespeaks the state of Indian politics today. But one point I wanted to make is if you travel outside Delhi, as I did, a lot of people talk about you, and young people talk about you, and it's completely wrong. The opinion in some Delhi circles that, you know, you're detached, you are, you know, not connected to the Indian masses, an opinion that itself strikes me as being detached from the fact that you've actually been elected 3 times from a communist redoubt, as I mentioned earlier. And I was recently in the former Soviet Union, Soviet countries, and in the Caucasus and in the Balkans, and the leadership there in quite a few of the countries speak of you, remember you from your UN days, praise you, and a former Labour leader praised you and described you as the hope of India. I mention all of this not to flatter you, but just to juxtapose it to what your own party said. One guy described you as a global citizen, not really Indian. The other said you're a guest artist. Mm-hmm. What does it feel like to be attacked in your own party for the simple reason that you're good at your job?
Thank you. Well, I will not contradict you for once. Sometimes the guest artist might steal the show, and that doesn't.
You're not allowed to audition for the main part.
No, but actually, the very fact that you're saying all of this suggests that the audition has been taking place, as it were, but not with those who are in a position to award the main part. So, shall we put that aside for a minute? No, look. I mean, I look at all of you and I say, you know, there are varying degrees of familiarity with Indian politics here. I can see at least one person who's a party colleague in Delhi who happens to be visiting. So there are people who know Indian politics from the inside and know why I'm saying what I'm saying. And there are people here, of course, who perhaps read about Indian politics in the newspapers, but tend to relate it to what you already understand, which is the British parliamentary system. And we don't, for example, the leader of the party in the parliament or in the lower house or the upper house is not elected by the MPs, but is appointed by the party president, which is very unusual in the parliamentary system, and that's the way it is in India. And it's been true, again, as I said, across parties. So in these circumstances, when Kapil says, you know, this and that, I mean, the answer truly is that some things are not in one's hands, and one does the best one can within the parameters available. And that's really probably where I'd leave this at this point.
Sure.
But thank you, Kapil. And the truth is that, you know, India is not the kind of system where, for example, an Obama can emerge. You know, there is no way you can come and buck your own party, defeat the party favorite in a primary, become a senator, in the course of the first term challenge the party favorite for the national nomination, win it, and then become president. I mean, that sort of equivalent just doesn't exist
Yeah.
and is unfeasible.
Yeah.
That's reality.
India is indeed a unique country. You can be 50 years old and still be called a youth leader.
That's
You can lose your own seat and still be the de facto leader of your party. India is quite unique. Moving on. Your most
Let's
recent,
move on.
yeah, your most recent book is The Fight for India's Soul. And we know that one fight that can't take place is the fight for Congress's soul. But how do you see this fight shaping up? And do you think it's already lost? Because I know for a very long time you've been invested in the idea of India. You were one of the best interpreters of Nehruvianism. Now you've come back to India, you've been steeped in its politics for 12 years, 13 years, and when you look at what's happened to India, so when I go back and read your work in the early 2000s and late up to 2010, you're very optimistic. You
Yeah.
say that Steven Spielberg couldn't make another Indiana Jones Temple of Doom because India's moved on, India's changed, but India's just sunk into the gutter again. Communal gutter for sure. And how do you fight that fight, and how do you restore India to its former glory as a secular state?
Right. So there are two arenas for this struggle. One is certainly in the realm of ideas, and there I'm proud I've contributed consistently to the national conversation. I've written, I've spoken, I'm on television, I'm on YouTube, I'm in Parliament, obviously, and I've tried to articulate consistently a vision of India as a land of pluralism, of diversity, where our diversity is a strength and not a weakness. I've tried to talk in terms of exalting the things that, despite our vast diversity, still unite us. I've talked about the differences between unity and uniformity, between acceptance and tolerance, between sort of coexistence and active cooperation, and all of these issues. And I think in the realm of sort of moving the needle on the national conversation, I can be reasonably proud of the contribution I've made and the extent to which things I've said have helped shape some of the discourse. The problem is, of course, the discourse doesn't matter in the second arena, and that's translating these ideas into a successful political result. And there I have to admit that if you look very, very honestly at where things are going, Mr. Modi has stolen a march on all the other opposition, on all the other parties combined. He's certainly probably the best orator in the Hindi language that this country has seen in living memory. He has a charismatic hold on the masses of Northern India, particularly of Northern India, which really cannot be rivaled by any of his rivals. So you have people who can hold their own in their own redoubts, in their own states, for example. But who is there anyone who can stand up and constitute a direct national challenger to him? In Hindi, probably not. So the effective answer then comes up: can you assemble a coalition of parties strong in regions that can, in the parliamentary system, collectively have enough seats to be able to cut him down to size? Now, don't forget that Mr. Modi won a majority in 2014 with 31% of the vote because the opposition was so fragmented, and in 2019 won an absolute majority for his own party with 37% of the vote. Now, currently the polls show him riding almost at 40. So, I mean, the fact still is there's 60% of the vote that could be consolidated in various places against him, and which unfortunately are not being, because the parties are divided by their own egos and their own challenges. One particular opportunity that has arisen right now is the presidential election. Now, in India, the president is elected by an electoral college consisting of both houses of parliament and all the state legislative assemblies. And those state legislative assemblies, each MLA's vote counts for a certain value, a certain number, and each MP's vote for a somewhat larger number, and they all come together to form a majority. And this time around, the BJP is still slightly short of what they need for a majority. So in theory, if every non-BJP parties got together and voted in one way for one candidate, that candidate could win. I say could win because, in fact, not only is the opposition divided, there are at least a couple of opposition parties which have tended to either side with the government or at the very least to not oppose its choices on a number of crucial votes, particularly in the upper house. So common sense tells you this isn't going to work. The BJP will put forward a candidate That candidate will start off with a mammoth amount of BJP votes, which will come to about 47, 46%. And for the remainder, one or two of the regional parties nominally in the opposition will either go along with him or abstain or whatever, and he'll get through. So that's almost certainly likely to happen. But this is a great opportunity for the opposition parties to sit around a table and show that they can work together. A process has begun. And I wish it well, because if they actually succeed, it almost doesn't matter who they put forward, because it's almost certain that person will lose. But if in the process they can forge unity, they can demonstrate a capacity to put their differences behind them, it could offer a very useful template for future possibilities in the country's politics. We have 2 years to go for a general election, which will take place by roughly April, May of 2024. And it's a crucial general election, as you said. If he is re-elected, it's quite likely there'll be fundamental changes. There's one particular thing, if people here are interested in our complicated North-South equations. There's a particular challenge coming up. We have a very unusual arrangement where in 1976 a constitutional amendment was passed freezing the allocation of parliament seats, the lower house seats, at the level of the 1971 census for 25 years. When that 25 years came up, the then government, which amazingly enough was a BJP government headed by Mr. Vajpayee, renewed the constitutional amendment unanimously in Parliament by another 25 years. And that now lapses in 2026. Now you may say, so what's the significance of this? Significance is very simple. The southern states, for the most part, are the ones that have got high human development indices. Women are more empowered, they get to have more say in how often they have children, how many children they have, and so on. And so population has stabilized there much earlier than elsewhere, and in 2 states, Kerala and Andhra, it's actually going down. In fact, the 2021 census couldn't take place because of COVID, but almost certainly when the numbers are out, Kerala will have lost population from 2011, and Andhra, if it hasn't done so now, will be well on the way to it by the next census. So you're looking at southern states which on a pure population basis will lose seats. And you're looking at northern states which have spectacularly failed on human development across the board, including, of course, having lots and lots of children and even a record growth rate in a couple of states, with the result that you will see that if you're simply dividing the seats according to population, the sort of Hindi heartland, where the BJP is strongest, will get a 2/3 majority in a new parliament, either by expanding the seats and thereby leaving the south with the seats it's got, but multiplying significantly the number of seats in the north, or you will end up with a parliament the same size but with fewer seats in the south and more in the north. Now, why is that important? That's important because a number of things can then happen. They don't need to happen, but they can happen with the BJP in power and a 2/3 majority automatically. There's been this needless controversy they've stirred up about making Hindi the national language, which the South has ferociously resisted. They could do that without giving a fig as to what the South thinks with a 2/3 majority. They can also declare a Hindu Rashtra, the BJP's official objective of creating Hindu denominational states. All of these changes are possible. And it would then become, as some people have already said, it is in the process of becoming a second republic rather than the republic that was established by Dr. Ambedkar's constitution in 1950.
And your next book, I understand, is about Ambedkar.
That's right.
So you managed to write it. Have you finished writing it?
I finished the first draft. It needs a little more work, but it's due for publication in India this year. In Britain, it'll probably take another year because it's a Manchester University Press publication, and they will take their time. I think that's how university presses are. But they're starting a series of biographies of developing country leaders who deserve to be better known. I think it's not a bad thing that it's there.
Shashi, do you fear a potential balkanization of India if the North were to impose its will on the South?
If they do a foolish thing like, for example, imposing Hindi, Tamil Nadu will not stand for it. I mean, Tamil Nadu is a state where, for example, I think my government created something called the Navodaya Vidyalayas, the Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas, which are schools that give you a very, very high standard of what the British and Indians call public school education, residential, high quality, but in rural areas and in areas where underprivileged people live, and they're given an opportunity to transform their lives by being admitted to these institutions. But one of the rules of the Navodaya Vidyalayas is they teach Hindi compulsorily, in addition to offering courses in English and so on, and in the local language. Well, Tamil Nadu, therefore, has become the only state of the union to refuse to have a Navodaya Vidyalaya in the state, even though the central government would have paid for it and Tamil children would have benefited, but they will not abide the idea of Hindi being compulsory in their state in any institution. So that's the sort of visceral opposition to it. I think you'll have a real challenge with a state like Tamil Nadu if you try and make Hindi the quote-unquote national language. And you will have similar challenges with many states if you declare India to be a Hindu Rashtra.
And you saw this happening in Yugoslavia from close quarters.
I saw it in very close quarters, the crumbling of Yugoslavia. It was quite astonishing because so much of what I heard from people, whether they meant it or not, was the kind of language you can expect to hear in India. A diplomat saying, they want to break my country up into 7 countries. I will have to claim 7 passports because I have this. A Serb nationalist leader, Radovan Karadzic, telling me, the EU says that I'm a Serb and not a Yugoslav. You can call a man a horse, but he's still a man. There's a lot of emotion and passion behind what they thought they were defending. But at the end of the day,
they all went their way.
They ended up going their way, and it's now, I suppose, de facto 7 countries and de jure 6 as far as the UN is concerned, because Kosovo is still not recognized by many other countries. But still, you're seeing a new reality, which when Yugoslavia was created in the 1920s, just after the First World War, as an outcome in the aftermath of an outgrowth of Slavic unity nationalism, no one would have expected that it would last only 70 years.
You've also written about Hinduism, and you are a practicing Hindu. You don't hide that fact.
Mm-hmm.
So you see a lot of commentary that says Hindu society has rotted away, that there are comparisons of that to German society at the rise of Hitler. Do you feel that there is a silent Hindu majority that actually abhors the kind of nationalism being practiced by Modi, or do you feel that a worrying majority of Hindu population in India is sympathetic to the project?
No, I think the silent majority, as the voting numbers also confirm, does not abide this kind of approach to Hinduism. And most people, when I published my book, Why I'm a Hindu, I was astonished by the very large number of people who don't share my political convictions, who came and told me how much my description of Hinduism resonated with their own experience of it, and how they felt that this wasn't that I spoke for their understanding of their own faith. It didn't prevent some of them from still being advocates of the BJP line, but I'm just saying that it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone sees Hinduism the way in which the Hindutva movement does. In fact, ironically, the founder of the Hindutva movement, V.D. Savarkar, very famously said that Hindutva is not Hinduism. In fact, he said that Hindu religion is mainly, I'm talking about something much broader in terms of, as he called it, national identity. And to this day, there's this whole argument that Hindutva is not religious nationalism, it's cultural nationalism. But be that as it may, the fact still is that it uses a religious label, the label of the followers of a particular religion, to ascribe certain authority for itself, and it's constantly looking for religious causes and symbols to hitch its political bandwagon to. The latest, of course, being reopening controversies about 2 mosques that have been built by destroying temples in the era of Aurangzeb. And, when people like me say, look, it certainly happened. The temples were destroyed or attacked or ruined or whatever, and this was done. But history is full of such incidents. What do we gain by reopening it now, 300 years later? For God's sake, let's focus on our development. People, I think, most people would be prepared to listen. But the politicians who are behind this, they have a certain malevolent energy of their own, which will perhaps drive these issues further forward. And that does worry me. Now, when you say, is the silent majority against it? Yes, but they are silent. And that's part of the problem. The silent majority doesn't always stand up for what it believes in. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I used that phrase because an Indian artist, Vishal Dadlani, tweeted a message to Muslims on behalf of Hindus like himself, essentially expressing solidarity and support. And I praised him for so doing, and I said, thank you for speaking for the silent majority. And the truth is that is indeed, to my mind, the silent majority, but it's insidiously creeping in the other direction. You've had a toxin that's been injected into the body politic, into the society. The body politic is already a lost cause, but into society, which is spreading. And in society, you've got people, therefore, thinking in ways that they didn't think of before, or wouldn't have thought it appropriate or decent to think of before. Things that when I was growing up in India, you wouldn't even say behind closed doors in the privacy of your living room, are now being declaimed openly by cabinet ministers from political platforms. So suddenly these ideas and these prejudices become respectable. That's what's
Do you ever, when you see the Prime Minister, do you ever tell him about the damage this is doing to India's reputation for instance, in the Middle East, where the people who revere India now worry about it. In other parts of the world, India is now known for its intolerance, and today somebody put a number on the cost of the hatred that has been pumped up. It's $646 billion, if you can.
Where did you get that number? It's a good.
The Business Standard did a piece today on it. That's the loss to India of all the violence that is taking place. Now,
I've been saying this for years to the Foreign Minister, for at least 2 years, because I'm a fairly frequent visitor, pre and post COVID, to that part of the world, and we have even met there a couple of times, and he is definitely uncomfortable by what's going on at home. The Prime Minister and I have not spoken for some years in this sort of way, but I think I will seek an opportunity to convey this, because I've been saying it publicly, and I'm assuming he hears it. It really is deplorable, because he actually has made a very genuine and impressive effort to cultivate relations, for example, with the Gulf countries. He's seen the strategic benefits thereof, and he's made a very good effort. He's traveled there personally a couple of times. He's sending his foreign minister and other ministers frequently. There's a great deal of emphasis being given to strengthening that relationship. Now, if you're doing that on the one hand and then undermining it at home through your policies, you've actually done yourself a great disservice.
Now, just to touch on Ukraine while we have time, you have been a vocal advocate for a stronger position by the Indian government on Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. I remember you wrote in 2008 that the idea of a confederation of democracies, a club of democracies, was a bad idea because it would exclude Russia and China from them. You criticized John le Carré, the spy novelist, for his Russophobia. And recently you wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs in which you concluded by saying that, freedom is under attack and we all need to coalesce around the idea of
So
freedom.
how did that change and why?
How did that change? Yeah.
Because Russia changed. I mean, don't forget that the Russia that I was writing about in the first decade of the 21st century was very different. Putin was asking Bill Clinton and Barack Obama if he could join NATO, for God's sake. It was a different Russia. And we still had a hope that instead of dividing the world into a reprise of the Cold War, we could actually have a world in which everyone would work together, that China, which seemed very committed at that point to its peaceful rise, so-called, would have no desire to renew its aggressive ways on our border, and so on. Everything has moved on.
The year in which you wrote that piece in 2008, China, there were 270 border violations by China.
Of India. No, but those, to be very honest, I mean, those violations, because I joined government a year later, so I can tell you, were very trivial. And in fact, for the most part, there was a clear understanding between both sides. Look, the Chinese say their border extends up to here, and we say our border extends up to there. So basically, there was a gentleman's agreement that they'll patrol up to here on Monday, and we'll patrol up to there on Tuesday. But every time they do that, it's considered a violation in theory. So I didn't take that terribly seriously.
Do you hear from your Russian...
Now what's happened is they've not only patrolled up to here, they've pitched tents and then made enduring structures. That's the problem.
Do you hear from your Russian interlocutors? Do they tell you privately that what's happened to you? Do they ask you?
No, though I'm sure that my old friend Sergei Lavrov will have a few choice words to utter in my direction when he sees me. But I've said publicly and in Parliament that we've never needed Russia less. I mean, the sad truth is that Russia today is not the Russia for which we were so grateful, number one, that because they'd given us military supplies, weapons, and so on, when the West was unwilling to do so. Now the West is willing to do so and readier to do so. Secondly, they gave us support on issues like Kashmir, but today, I'm afraid, that support isn't going to be terribly needed or necessary. But if it is, the French will give us the same support, the Americans will give us the same support, etc. Third, in any case, it was the Soviet Union and not Russia that did all that for us, and Ukraine was therefore also a country we ought to be grateful to as part of that system. And finally, I mean, the weapons themselves, I mean, the truth is that those weapons, the Russians are going to find very difficult now to manufacture because sanctions have crippled their capacity. There are no semiconductor chips coming into the country. There's no real credible electronics industry anymore. Somebody was telling me they're buying a new car in Russia. You look for a car made in 2021 because the electronics of cars made in 2022 have all been shot. There's nothing left. So it really is a challenging time for the Russians. And whatever happens in the war, however it evolves, whenever it ends, they will end up weaker than they were before, and they will end up, therefore, that much more dependent on China. And meanwhile, China has become much more belligerent than the China of 2008, and the China of today has actually killed 20 Indian soldiers 2 years ago. And what was that famous line? When facts change, my opinions change too, dear boy. Yeah.
But what if you were involved in international diplomacy right now, how would you seek an end to this crisis in Ukraine?
Honestly, I would have sought that in before the 24th of February. I did write an op-ed on that at the time when war erupted, saying while the Americans and the Brits were screaming from the rooftops for 7 weeks that war was imminent, where was the Secretary General? Why didn't he hop on a plane, go to Moscow and say, listen, I'm not assuming the Americans are right, but if you have these concerns, talk to me, what are your minimum irreducible demands, and I'll hop into a plane, go to Kyiv, and see how much we can negotiate for you short of war. And that could have been a win-win. I mean, frankly, when Clinton wanted to bomb Baghdad the first time, Kofi Annan hopped on a plane without anyone's permission, went to Baghdad. I went with him, so I can tell you.
Yeah.
And he was able to buy 6 months of peace. The fact is that in this particular instance, there was no international initiative for peace by anybody. Obviously, NATO couldn't have done it because NATO was seen or portrayed as part of the problem, but the UN could and should have done it, and no one did. And if the Secretary General felt that as a European himself and a NATO member country national that he couldn't do it, he could have found an envoy to go. There's no shortage of senior diplomats who'll be happy to serve in this kind of task. So I think it was a great pity. Now I think we are in a problem because the last impressions that I'm getting from people who know is that both sides are convinced that they're going to prevail in this, and neither is in a hurry to sue for peace.
Right. Shashi, you're also an outstanding writer of fiction. I reread your first novel, The Great Indian Novel, which was published in 1989. Are you going to return to fiction at any time?
I'd like to, Kapil. And the problem with fiction is that it's not interruptible from the writer's point of view. You construct this illusory world, this alternative moral universe full of characters, incidents, dialogues, and so that have to be as real to you while you're living in that world as what's going on in your daily life. But when you've got the kind of life I lead in politics now, the UN before that, it's not possible because that sort of glass palace of illusion gets shattered every once in a while. You can't keep sticking the pieces together. So in the first decade of the century, my last novel was published in 2001, Riot. In the first decade, I think there must have been at least 4, if not 5, novels I began and abandoned. So my laptop at that time was littered with these half-begun novels because I couldn't sustain the illusion with all the other interruptions. Whereas non-fiction, you can pick up the pieces even after weeks of neglect. Go back to what you were writing, reread what you've written, and the train of thought will come because it's what you thought, believed, whatever, and you'll carry on. So that's why, of my first 5 books, 4 were fiction, and every single book since has been non-fiction. So it really is.
You want to return to that?
I'd like to, and I think I used to joke, and now it may well be a serious prospect that the voters will one day return me to the world of literature. But even if the voters don't, I think, if I allow myself not to, I really have said so much, pretty much everything there is to say about the contemporary political situation in India, because there seemed to be a moral urgency to do it. Whether and why I'm a Hindu, where I gave an alternative view of Hinduism from the Hindutva version being spread, or the paradoxical Prime Minister, where I gave an alternative view of Modi to the view that was being spread, or the battle of belonging, as it's called in India, which is the struggle for India's soul here, where I talk about really contemporary politics right up to 2020. I've been there, I've said all of these things, and now I feel that treating those themes again would merely be repetitive. I'd just be saying what I've said before. So this may be the right moment after the Ambedkar book is finally put to bed. It may be the right time for me to return to fiction. I've got some ideas tossing around in my head. I won't mention what they are for fear of tempting Providence again. But yeah, I'd like to get to
But you can't do that if you become the leader of the Congress Party and you're very busy running the party. Do you consume a lot of fiction?
Not recently, no. In fact, I used to read voraciously and avidly, and I find
you read a book a day, right?
That was one foolish year, and I don't recommend it to any. Some poor teenagers who saw the story about me that when I was all of 12 or 13, I think, I set myself the challenge of reading 365 books in the year. And I finished by Christmas, but it was insane. I kept a list and so on. It was crazy. You should never read to a deadline like that. Reading should be for pleasure. And I deprived myself of that pleasure, so I vowed never to do it again. But I'd proven to myself it could be done. Today I don't have the time. Remember, that was in India without television, obviously no mobile phones, laptops, Nintendo, computers. So the number of distractions available were so few. It was either reading books or going off and playing cricket with your friends downstairs. That was about the choices available to me. So I read. Today, everyone has so many alternatives. So I'm not just denying myself the pleasures of fiction. I don't even have time to watch Netflix. So it's one of those what everybody else is doing.
Are there young writers who impress you these days? Do you read them?
There are indeed, and I must say that there's some terrific talent available in the country. And there was a time when I was living in America, and I was able to help kickstart a few careers of Indian novelists by getting them by reviewing them myself prominently in places like the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, Book World, and so on. I think I reviewed the first novel of Vikram Chandra. I read Earth and Pouring Rain. I reviewed the first novel of Manil Suri. There were 3 or 4 novelists whom I'm pleased to say got perhaps more attention than they otherwise would have, because, for example, I was commissioned to write a short 600-word review, and I'd call the editor back and say, this book deserves more. Give me 1,000 words. And when I wrote the 1,000 words, they put it on the front page of the LA Times book review in one example. And that sort of thing was important.
I'm sorry that you don't write that stuff anymore.
I just don't have the time, Kapil. In fact, I find that there is, first of all, an enormous amount of reading to do. Apart from starting the day with 4 newspapers, I get so much sent to me in the course of the day. WhatsApp has become everyone's daily library. I mean, everyone's sending you links of various sorts. And I would say 90% of the links I'm sent would have turned out to be worth reading. So I do, because people know what I'm interested in. And so I'm reading far more and from a far larger variety of sources than I would have done in the old days. But I'm also reading much less between covers. And that's a pity. And then, of course, I write. I mean, I'm under the cosh a lot because I'm maintaining too many columns. I have 2 weekly columns. I have a monthly column and a fortnightly column. And that's already too much, but it does get my ideas out all over, and so for the moment I'm doing all of that. At some point, one will have to draw a halt to it.
I just want to touch on your personal life, because it would be remiss not to do that. You recently said that you've endured 7.5 years of hell because your wife died in 2014, tragically. And you were accused of abetting her death. And the presumption of innocence, which is, I think, the foundation of criminal legal system, was withheld from you. And you had to prove your innocence, as it were. And while the investigations were ongoing, you were harried and harassed by members of the journalistic profession. And there was a politician who wanted you to be taken into custody, and they said many things. Instead of facts and dispassionate investigation, we got lurid speculation. Now that you've been pronounced innocent, now that you've been completely exonerated, do you plan on taking any kind of legal actions against these people? I say that not for you, but for the principle.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, not only is everything you said accurate, but there's also the fact that many of the allegations made were based on false facts. I mean, things invented that had never happened, and that this particular politician egregiously claimed had occurred, because that his capacity for fantasizing and being given space in the media while so doing is quite extraordinary. Well, I was strongly advised by everybody that I should not sue him, because that's exactly what he wants. He wants to be sued so that he can grandstand in court. He's a lawyer by training, and that I shouldn't do it. So I didn't. I decided, however, to sue one of the most offensive channels, a channel that's universally reviled in India, but still has the highest ratings, alas, because what he offers is a sort of theatre that the middle class like to settle down in front of at the end of the day. So I did sue him for criminal defamation. But our legal system being what it is, that suit, which was filed in 2015 or 16, still hasn't been heard.
It's ongoing.
Well, it's ongoing in the sense that it hasn't but hasn't been listed. There was a hearing in which he sort of screamed freedom of the press, or rather his lawyer did. He didn't have to go, and I didn't go either. My lawyer went. The judge said, well, you toned down the rhetoric or some such. He didn't tone down the rhetoric, so we went back to the judge and said this case has to be heard, whereupon he managed to win a stay, and that stay still hasn't been lifted. I think the stay is operational under Indian law for a maximum of 1 year. Then COVID came and so on, and so for 2 years, these would not have been considered priority cases. Only priority cases were heard in the courts during COVID. Now that COVID seems to be pretty much seen as over, I mean, we hope that's true, I suppose I could seek to reopen the case again. I've spoken to my lawyers about it. My lawyers are, of course, the same lawyers who also defended me on the false charges, and they're very skittish because they know how much the dice is stacked against somebody in my position as an opposition politician. And they're worried that if I were to raise the issue again by trying to revive the defamation suit, that it might provoke the authorities to file an appeal against the dismissal of the judge. By the way, when you speak of exoneration, I was never charged.
Yeah.
For 7.5 years, this lurid speculation went on in the media, but it was at the stage of hearings to determine whether there was a charge that the judge threw the entire thing out. Saying the complete case was built on a tissue of insubstantial allegations. And so, strictly speaking, I've never had a court charging me with anything, but the police's attempts to get charges framed was dismissed. Now that can be appealed at a higher level, and though the time for appeal has long since passed, it's not been a year since that judgment, the fact is that in our country, if the government or the police claim that they have grounds to appeal, courts tend to condone the delay. So I can understand my lawyer's hesitation in reviving a case that will remind people, including the police, that all this is still pending. I don't know. We'll see. But I do agree with you that on principle, a fraudulent exercise of journalistic freedom, which involves literally the invention and assertion of lies as the basis for some of the charges, that really does need to be challenged, and that's why it's filed the suit in the first place.
And I wish you well, as I imagine most people here will open up the floor to questions. Sure. If you're happy to take them.
Happy to take some.
If you're asking a question, please state your name and your affiliation. If you're making a comment, please keep it brief. Thank you.
You pick the question.
Yep, please go ahead, sir.
Hi, hello, I'm Brian. Dr. Tharoor, lovely to see you again.
Thank you.
Scholar. I just want to ask you a question concerning the prognosis for India, which is essentially we see India in crooks of authoritarian encroachment or entrenchment, very much like many other countries around the world today. It is infeasible, as you point out just then, to start an alternative party. Your current party's administration and leadership is unwilling to lead the charge or to organise a charge against us, to put up a genuine fight of resistance. The future looks grim. Will you stand or consider standing for president if that's indeed an option on the table for you?
You know, the party?
No, for the country as a whole.
No, the country as a whole, I think the presidency, first of all, you've got to be nominated by a party, and I don't think any party is going to be, I mean, first of all, I don't think my own party is considering the option, and the other parties are not going to nominate a congressman. I think the search is on for somebody who will attract consensus amongst the opposition parties. I really hope there is a united opposition candidate. And the names that are doing the rounds now are really very impressive names, one of whom in particular, a non-political figure, could attract consensus. So it may all happen in the next few days. I'm not even there. So no, that's not an option. But, you know, I've noted, I mean, positions honestly matter much less than the impact you can have. And as I say, I'm proud I've had an impact on the national discourse. The question is whether I can have an impact through the ability to make decisions, as it were, that will actually change lives for the better. As an MP, there's only so much you can do, and as an opposition MP, there's so much less than you can do. So it's been challenging, and that's the striving that Kapil has been goading me into attempting, and I hope I will. But India's prospects as a whole could be great. I mean, the irony is that in many, many ways, we're poised for demographic dividend. We have a larger youthful, starting age working population than any other country in the world, including China. We have technological savvy that's been very, very well developed domestically that could position us significantly. We have very skilled and able diplomats to sort of articulate our place in the world. We have a lot of good things going for us. If it weren't for the dysfunctionality of our domestic politics dragging us into the mire, I think we could actually have a very optimistic story to tell. And as Kapil was rightly saying, my book's up to about 2010. Look at something like The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, for example, was sort of a gung-ho celebration of India's future. And today, it seems it was built on sand.
So,
Yes, please, madam. Yes.
Chandrika Pathak, just what is your take then, given what you have said right now? What gives you hope for India? Because frankly, it's a very bleak picture that you're painting for those of us who believe in liberal democracies.
Well, there's always a hope that people will see the error of their ways. I mean, I know I can see your expression, I understand why it may not. But you know that old line of Churchill's about doing the right thing after exhausting all the available alternatives. Maybe Modi will end up there. I mean, he's exhausting all the available alternatives pretty thoroughly. I mean, he's made disastrous mistake after disastrous mistake. Demonetization, which knocked 2.6% of the GDP growth, followed by a hasty botched rollout of otherwise a good scheme, the GST scheme, which now is in many ways a dog's breakfast, but has finally begun working effectively. Punitive taxes on fuel that retarded growth and caused inflation. Then you've got not just economic mismanagement, but very high unemployment. At one point, the highest unemployment ever recorded since figures began to be recorded of unemployment. So you've got every sort of negative you can possibly imagine. And we feel that he can't possibly, do any worse across all these parameters, but he still keeps winning elections. He's got some good welfare projects, gas cylinders and toilets and light switches and checks to farmers and so on, which also help
So
them with
do you
the
think
votes.
this recent Mideast issue that has come up will make him correct course?
My hope is that it might. My hope is that at least, what I don't understand is why he chooses to stay silent all the time. Even the head of the RSS, some other ship as it were, of the Hindutva movement, even he made a speech. Before this particular eruption, he made a speech in the context of the temple of business I mentioned to you, where he said, why should we look for a shivling under every mosque? Which I thought was a very good message to give, and I welcomed it openly and publicly. But Mr. Modi just doesn't speak. Now, it's all very well to say I'm not going to comment on every little thing going on. I'm the Prime Minister, but this is not a little thing. This is a very big thing that he's chosen not to comment on. And I pushed for this, and in fact, just last weekend I gave an interview to the big national news agency, the Press Trust of India, which was all over the country, saying it's time for the Prime Minister to break his silence. And it has been reported extensively, including in the Hindi language media. So let's see if he's provoked enough to do something.
Ajitha, go ahead.
Aparajita.
Aparajita, sorry.
From Stefanian.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
I
I go back to the vintage when we didn't have any of your gender in college, but
was
nice to have
telling
you.
my friend earlier about the Antony and Cleopatra situation, having to bring in Cleopatra from around the house. But my question was more about, you were mentioning development and how, Modi keeps going on and on about that. And yes, he has those welfare projects, which I suppose, at the risk of stereotyping, bring the lesser educated masses along. But what about the middle class, upper middle class, very educated people, young people, professionals, as well as NRIs who keep going on and on about development and he's great, and how do we just expose the blatant lies behind all of that?
Well,
What is going on
exposing
there?
it
Why-
to the educated elite is happening already. I think all the parties have been good at that. The problem is that the educated elite in a country India's size don't swing elections. And that's ultimately going to be the challenge. I mean, there are an awful lot of people, even in relatively literate Kerala, for example, who will, as the Americans say, drink the Kool-Aid because that's what's offered to them, and they are prepared to believe what the government tells them. These little welfare schemes, by the way, are very politically targeted. BJP volunteers go with lists of government beneficiaries, go to their homes and say, you got this from Mr. Modi, you're going to vote for him, right, or his candidate, and of course they do. So these things make a big, you've converted, whereas when we were in power, our emphasis was on creating rights-bearing citizens, conscious of their rights in a democracy. Here, the citizen has been reduced to a welfare-receiving subject who should be suitably grateful for the welfare he's received. That's essentially where we are.
Sir, please go ahead. Yes.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor, really good to see you. My name is Vikram and I am from Indian Overseas Congress.
Right.
A couple of weeks back, Mr. Gandhi was here and
Yes.
we had a few days with him. And we had lots of discussion how we can improve the party's internet democracy. And now party president post is open for election. So would you be willing to contest that post?
For the post of party president? Yeah, if there were to be an election, it's certainly an option. Some colleagues want me to do it. A lot will depend, because at the moment the AICC has not been summoned yet, has not been convened yet. There's no announcement. But I should say, in all fairness, that it's a foregone conclusion, given the composition of the electorate, which is all appointed themselves by the existing party leadership, that a nominee of the official party leadership is almost certain to be the president. If it's Mr. Gandhi himself, it's one thing. If it's somebody he's put forward, you can be reasonably sure that that person would win. So to stand is simply to make a statement. It is not necessarily with a realistic hope of being able to win that position with this electorate.
The Baath Party in Syria is more democratic.
That, I think, is an exaggeration.
Yes, madam.
Considerable exaggeration.
Roshni from Queen Mary University.
Yes.
Hi.
So, can I ask a question to Kapil instead of...
Yeah, please do. Give me a break.
No disrespect to Shashi. Yes. I just came across a tweet where you say Rahul Gandhi traveled between 2015 and 2019. He traveled about 4 to 5 times every month abroad. So I follow Indian politics quite closely, and for me it sounded as though it was a far-fetched statement. So just my question is, was that based on evidence, or was it from
That was
some
based-
WhatsApp university knowledge?
No, that was based on the statement by the Home Ministry that Rahul Gandhi, between 2015 and 2019, has made 247 trips abroad, which averages to about 5 trips a month. I wasn't saying he travelled 5 times a month. I said he averaged about 5 trips a month, because he's required in all these countries. They need him. They all call upon his brilliance and expertise, so he travels abroad.
Do you confirm that? Do you confirm that is true?
Well, no, I don't doubt Kapil's researching abilities as a journalist. If he found that Home Ministry figure, it must be right, because the Home Ministry does provide security and so on right up to the departure gate. I think he has declined security abroad, but nonetheless, they would have these numbers available.
That wasn't WhatsApp. I'm not on WhatsApp.
Thank you.
Oh, not WhatsApp University.
Yes, Keshiva, sorry.
Keshiva, go ahead. Fiction. So I was very struck.
Not only fiction, Keshiva,
right? When I was very struck by something you didn't say in your list including your list of Mr. Modi's blunders, which is his handling of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And there are.
I didn't even get that far.
Yeah.
I was still stuck at 16 or 17.
There's at least, I mean, you may have a longer list, but there's at least 4 blunders, individual missteps I can think of. The first is the nature of the initial lockdown, the suddenness, the absence of any kind of humanitarian support. The second,
And the lack of consultation with the state governments which had to implement the law.
Absolutely, the lack of logistical planning. The second, so everything to do with the first lockdown.
And the lack of notice, all of it.
The second is underordering vaccines.
Correct.
Which meant that when the second wave arrived, we had an unvaccinated population, and by the time we were vaccinated and we're saying 100 crore doses, it's far too late. The third is declaring victory on COVID in February of 2021, dismantling the extra oxygen capacity, and the fourth is, I suppose, as Gen Z would say, gaslighting the entire population by lying about the number of people who have died. Any one of these seems to be
And swindling the population with PM cares.
Yeah. Oh yes, that's a bit. Any one of these would seem to me to be completely unforgivable. But we've had state election after state election, and the opposition has refused to politicize the Prime Minister's handling of COVID. So I generally think politicians know politics best. So what do they know that we don't? Why is this not an issue?
I think what they've found, and in fact journalists have reported this, is that for the vast majority of people, they don't blame Mr. Modi for it. They think it's fate, it's nature, it's what can you do about a virus, it's beyond human agency. You would have had to construct the case that as soon as you said it, we all understood what you were talking about. But for the relatively simpler, less sophisticated voters, it would be a hard sell. At least that was the conclusion that those political parties that could have profited from highlighting this failed to make. There were evocative images talked about of bodies being floated down the Ganga by people who couldn't afford to cremate them, and with all the long queues, and the people couldn't afford funerals and so on. So, but there was also perhaps a slightly, as it turns out now, exaggerated assumption that so many people were hurt by the experience personally that alone would make them vote against the government. Didn't happen.
Media.
Right. Sorry. Who wants to ask a question? Could you please raise your hands?
Yeah.
The woman in the middle there. Yes, madam. Please go ahead. That's
Yes,
Yasmin. Yasmin from The
Yasmin.
Atlantic. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a comment not too long ago about concern for human rights in India, and I was wondering what your thoughts were about the role that India's friends, like the United States, could play in this role. You know, do critical words from friends sort of blister less, or is there a role there? Do you think India would be interested in it? And do you think the Biden administration, by extension, has a responsibility to speak out on this particular issue?
So, which bigger issue? Perhaps I missed a few words.
On kind of the communal violence and human rights more broadly in India.
No, I'm personally not terribly keen on countries commenting on other countries' internal affairs, because there's really no sort of moral argument that is truly credible, given that every country is selective in its morality. So we attack the Soviet Union for, I beg your pardon, the Russians for violating international law and invading a country, but we don't seem to remember that America violated international law when it invaded Iraq. We sort of object to an autocratic dictatorship in Moscow. We don't object to one in certain Middle Eastern countries which might be selling us oil, and so on and so forth. And this kind of selectivity, which is entirely understandable in terms of sensible geopolitics, makes it that much more difficult to say that there is a sort of credible universal standard that warrants somebody sitting in America passing comments on what's happening in India. I would rather that we Indians fought our own battles domestically, that we challenged what was going wrong ourselves. And I must say, there isn't a single human rights violation in India that hasn't first been exposed by an Indian, whether it's an Indian NGO, an Indian human rights body, an Indian journalist, or Indian activist. I think India is capable enough and is a sufficiently mature democracy to be able to fight those battles internally, even if it looks like our fighting hasn't helped us to sort of uphold all these standards and values in daily lives. Lots of things are happening that are reprehensible, and we say so within our domestic space. But the truth is, I don't think it'll be particularly helpful. Certainly a public condemnation would not be helpful. If privately, countries that Mr. Modi needs, behind closed doors and without embarrassing or seeming to be sitting in judgment on the government, were to say to him, listen, this is difficult for us. I think that, it would be difficult for us to be more helpful to you, or to sell you this or that, or to include you in this or that, or to give you this or that, if you continue like this. That kind of message might be very effective, but not a public intervention. I think that will be counterproductive.
Right. The Summit for Democracy invitation, for example.
So I'm not hearing you very well from there.
Sorry, that's okay. Thank you for your...
Thank you, Yasmin. Sorry.
Tripur
Maybe
Daman.
just project if you're speaking from the back.
Tripur
Hi,
Daman.
Tripur Daman. Yeah, hi.
Tripur Daman Singh from the University of London. Thank you for a very illuminating talk. But my question to you is, what do you think about the times or about Indian society that has made it peculiarly susceptible to the Hindutva message and to Modi's rhetoric? Because Hindutva has been a strand in Indian politics for many, many, many years. And what is it that has made Indian society so susceptible to it?
Well, the Hindutva concept goes back to the 1920s, as you know, Tripur Daman, and it really remained a fringe idea for about 6 years. I mean, really, if you look at the votes polled by those who advocated Hindutva, it was really a fraction, right from the Hindu Mahasabha days before independence, the Jansangh days after, and finally the BJP days. And the 80s began with the BJP having 2 MPs in the lower house. So it's not as if it was a strain of thought that seemed to axiomatically appeal across India. But I think a number of factors played a part in the 80s, which began the rise. One was undoubtedly the desire of some Hindus for a unifying message. Remember that the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe reservations that Dr. Ambedkar instituted in the Constitution were then supplemented by the Mandal reservations in the 1980s, which seemed to be slicing and dicing Indian society by caste. And of course, for the political benefit of representatives of those castes. And for the BJP to say, let's look beyond these things that divide us and focus on the common cause that unites us, and then to seize on the Ram Janmabhoomi, which particularly in northern India has a tremendous resonance as the widely believed birthplace of Ram, and then conduct his nationwide chariot yatras to get to rouse public support. All of that, I mean, it's quite striking to see the BJP going from 2 seats in 84 to 86 seats in 89 to 116 in 91. It's been a steady climb since to 182 in 98 and 99, and then of course we were able to cut them down in 2004. But that rise had clearly a lot more to do with these political factors than necessarily with social ones. When Mr. Modi came to power, people forget that his 2014 campaign was almost entirely on development. It was all Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. I'm the CEO of Gujarat Inc. and I will make of India what I've made of Gujarat. I will develop you, bring prosperity, give you jobs. That was the message. That if his 31% represented a 12% increase on his party's vote in the previous election, almost all that 12% was voting for his development message. They wanted a capable CEO. But somehow, between then and now, his song has changed. He's singing a different tune now, and 2019 onwards, he's doubled down on the Hindutva message. He may have actually played his cards wrong. We don't know. It may well be that the worm will turn. People say enough of this divisive nonsense. But for now, he is winning messages, I argue, despite the doubling down on Hindutva rather than because of. Because of has infected some people's minds, Hindus across northern India, but not everyone. And to this day, I believe he doesn't have a majority of Hindus, even in the north. But
Lynn O'Donnell from Foreign Policy Magazine.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for the opportunity. You mentioned before that you didn't think that it was appropriate to comment on human rights violations, whatever was going on in other countries. My area of interest has long been Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
India was a very good friend of the Republic,
Mm-hmm.
disappeared overnight, and sent a few diplomats back recently
Mm-hmm.
without recognition. I'm just wondering, now it's becoming that black hole of potential jihadism. What is your view, not only from your own perspective as an Indian politician, but also with maybe harking back to your former UN incarnation.
Right.
Now I see the UN, the outgoing UNAMA person sitting down with terrorists and drug dealers and saying, can we talk counter-terrorism and counter-narcotics? It just blows my mind. What's your view? What should be done?
Well, there's no question that the first incarnation of Taliban as a government, the so-called Islamic Emirate, in the second half of the 90s, was disastrous. And not only were they oppressive of human rights of their own citizens, and particularly the women and girls, but they were indeed a hotbed of terrorism. From India's point of view, we were particularly worried because the government was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Pakistani ISI, and a lot of things that happened out of Afghanistan targeted us, including the hijacking of a plane to Kandahar, the killing of a couple of the passengers on it. We've seen the Afghans complicit in the release of convicted Pakistani terrorists as a result of that hijacking, who then went on, amongst other things, to kill Daniel Pearl and so on. It really has been a horrendous experience. And so we obviously didn't want them coming back, which is why our largest single foreign aid program ever has been in Afghanistan, where we spend more than $2 billion of Indian taxpayers' money after 2001, after America blasted the Taliban out of office. And we've done everything from building a dam, the Salma Dam, to and the entire highway from Zaran to Dalaram across southwest Afghanistan, to the 24/7 electricity from Pule Charki down to Kabul, to the Parliament building, which is built by India as well. So we've done all of this, plus the maternal and child health hospital, which is named for Indira Gandhi, lots and lots of micro projects, girls' schools, all sorts of things. Because our idea was, how do we strengthen Afghanistan, give them a chance to not ever be again the kind of country the Taliban could take over. And boy, we've seen how that's turned out. The Taliban are back. and all of their sins could be repeated. So we were very wary. But at the same time, the Taliban have been sending reassuring signals that they've learned too from their mistakes of the past, and that countries like India don't need to fear a repeat of what happened the first time, and so on. So very gingerly, after 9 months after they've come to power, we have sent a delegation there, and I think we will restore a presence in the embassy. Not at ambassadorial level, and we've not recognized the Taliban government. We just feel the need to have eyes and ears on the ground. But I think the world is still unable to decide in favor of recognizing this government and working with it. And that's, I think, that caution is entirely understandable and should continue. But the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is so terrible that we shouldn't possibly allow the people to suffer as much as they're suffering for the sins of who's ruling them. I mean, when you think in terms of the starvation levels that are mounting, the horrendous little stories of little girls being sold for a pittance by parents who can't eat that day unless they sell their baby daughter, that sort of thing. You feel we really ought to release some of the Afghan money held in American banks, give some of that money just for humanitarian supplies, maybe provide food, provide rations, provide essentials, make it possible for them to eat. I was one of the signatories to the that petition by former UN officials that asked for this to be done. Only humanitarian relief because the people are suffering. But every other respect, caution is indicated, is warranted.
If you want to ask a question, we've got time for about 2 or 3 questions. Captain, please go ahead.
Matthew Mazunche from Cochin. So we just had a Trikakra election in Kerala,
yeah.
And Uma Thomas won it really handily.
Yeah.
And I was purely down to local support against the left redoubt, as you speak.
Though we all went there on campaign, so it wasn't just local support.
Well, I don't know. I'm not really sure that helped.
I can tell you I spent 2 days there on the ground myself. So.
Okay. I didn't see it at all.
What did you say? You didn't see me at all?
No.
Oh, well.
Fair enough. But I'm just saying, why isn't that kind of, in the ground sort of worker thing not being duplicated across the rest? I'm genuinely curious because...
Well, a by-election the entire party can focus on. When a general election is taking place, you have to 140 constituencies to deal with, that's all. I mean, I think in a by-election, the opposition can always, Matthew, make a very, very serious concerted effort, focus all their resources, all their personnel, etc. I don't think there was a single Kerala leader of any consequence, not just in the Congress, but in the UDF, who didn't go, even if you didn't see them. Everyone went and campaigned effectively. The candidate was also a very charming person whom the public were very happy to support. There was a sympathy element because her husband had been well liked and well respected. So everything fell in place, and it was a bigger victory than anyone expected.
Yeah.
Because when I went there, everyone said she'll win, but it'll be a squeaker. It wasn't a squeaker. It was actually a bigger majority than her late husband had. So I think it was a success. Can we replicate that in other by-elections? Possibly. In a general election, remains to be seen. I'm not so sure.
Martin.
Yeah. Thank you, Modern Review, for having us invited over here. My name is Mansi. I'm an entrepreneur based in London. And leaving besides religion, culture, political rivalry and stuff, what would be your vision if we were fortunate to have you as the leader of our country with regards to infrastructure? So rails, roadways, transport, medical, healthcare facilities. Where do you see India as such, let's say down a decade from now?
I mean, those are the things we can get right, because frankly, we're quite behind. So Mr. Gadkari, for example, the surface transport and highway minister, has done a pretty good job, and he's certainly accelerated the pace of highway construction in ways that will, I think, show good results. Airport construction has gone very well, largely because it's been handed over to the private sector for a change, and we now have lots of gleaming airports of international standard, and they're more on the way. So that sort of hard infrastructure is what is actually both working and workable. The problem is the soft infrastructure. The problem is the healthcare, the fact that there are still millions, hundreds of millions perhaps, who don't have a primary health center within a 5-kilometer in a walk of their place of residence. Where you don't have decent, good quality schools that will give you learning outcomes that will be useful in the real world. A lot of people going to government schools are not learning very much and ending up, with 5th graders scoring below second grade level in the global PISA test and so on. So those are education, healthcare, and of course the possibilities of jobs and training and skill development. All of those are the areas where not terribly well done.
The gentleman in the last.
So I guess I'm just trying to cross paths with you. So I went to Hindu College. My name is Aditya. So you mentioned that the Congress Party, I mean the BJP has been interested in imposing Hindi on the rest of the country. I wonder if it doesn't smack of hypocrisy, because the Congress Party has a sordid history of attempting to impose Hindi on a reluctant populace. So you mentioned the Navodaya schools. I went to one of the Kendriya schools in Chennai, and everyone who went there, whether they were Tamil or Malayali or Telugu, had to read and write in Hindi. So they were unable to speak, read or write the language of their soul. I don't think the Congress Party has waged any opposition against the Kendriya Vidyalaya schools. And the Constitution itself, Article 351 of the Constitution, supports the promotion of Sanskrit language, so which I think is an affront to every living language in India. Sanskrit is dead and extinct, but the Constitution supports its promotion, whereas we have classical languages like Tamil and Telugu, but the Constitution doesn't speak a word about any of those. And there's not even any acknowledgement of Rajiv Gandhi's massacre of tens of thousands of Tamils in Sri Lanka, the Indian peacekeeping force, which was dubbed the innocent people killing force. There's not even any acknowledgement, let alone any remorse or penitence. But when one of the convicts of the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case was released recently, the congressmen in Tamil Nadu made a huge hue and cry. So I think the Congress Party also has a North Indian bias, except for a few cosmopolitan and liberal-minded politicians like you. So what do you have to say about this?
Well, you've raised a lot of things there which I'm afraid are not strictly speaking. For example, the Kendriya Vidyalayas were actually set up as schools for central government employees, so that when they get transferred from one part of India to another, the children shouldn't suffer. And therefore, though eventually if there are not enough central government employees, seats are available to others, the reason that they have to have Hindi is because if you're posted in North India, you need Hindi. You can't suddenly have a gap of 3 years when your dad was posted in Chennai and then go back and catch up with your classmates. So because these are central government employee schools, including the armed services, national scientific establishments, all the central institutions in the public sector, all of those are the ones whom these schools are for, Hindi has to be offered. And even the Tamil Nadu government does not challenge that. So that's on the Kendriya Vidyalayas. When it comes to things like the IPKF, as you know, it's a much more complicated story than that, because Rajiv Gandhi actually not only wanted to see the Tamils doing well in Sri Lanka, he took off his personal vest and sent it to Velupillai Prabhakaran, who was unsure about signing the peace agreement. And Rahul Gandhi is the one who delivered that vest to Prabhakaran, and he's told me the story himself. These are very, very important considerations you're overlooking. So what happened was that the LTTE betrayed an agreement they'd voluntarily signed, in which Rajiv Gandhi had staked India's prestige, and India therefore had no choice but to uphold its end of the bargain and maintain the peace by cracking down on those who were violating it. That's the only reason why they ended up killing LTTE members, and LTTE members ended up killing them and assassinating Rajiv Gandhi. But it wasn't a simple black and white story. It was, unfortunately, a situation where something undertaken with the best of intentions ended up, frankly, being violated by one side, and that side wasn't the Indian side to begin with.
We've got 5 minutes. Sorry,
we've got 5
me.
minutes.
So I just
want
want
to
to
say
say
other things there, but broadly speaking, on the release, it should be pointed out that Rajiv Gandhi's descendants have called for the pardoning of all of these people, not necessarily for their release. They just wanted them not to be given death sentences and so on. And Priyanka Gandhi, the daughter, actually visited these people in prison. So I think it's difficult to suggest that there's been any vindictiveness on the Gandhi family's part towards these people. There were some in the Congress who felt that it was wrong not to release the man, but to celebrate his release the way the Tamil Nadu chief minister receiving him and offering him sweets and so on. And after all, the man was convicted of buying something that enabled the assassination. It was the battery that operated the bomb that actually was purchased by this chap. But anyway,
right, we've got. Sorry, man. I'm sorry. I want to get as many people as possible. So what we'll do is we'll take about 3 questions, and then do you want
give
to
a quick answer to everyone?
Yes.
Okay.
The gentleman here, sir.
Yeah,
Quick.
now that we are on Sri Lanka,
Yeah.
the events in Sri Lanka show that there is a link between the Adani group and the BJP, which your
No great surprise, Mr. Modi campaigned extensively in Mr. Adani's aircraft in
to
2014.
the extent of money power in Indian politics, which seems to be weighted in favor of the BJP. So is there any sort of way in which you could counter that money power? And as a supplementary question, can I also ask you, now that there seems to be a way open for entry of India into Sri Lanka, is this an opportunity for displacing Chinese influence in the country?
Thank you. Should I answer that, Kapil, or
Yeah,
collect all the
what's
questions?
your name, sir? Professor?
Sorna Raja, I'm
Okay.
from the University of Singapore.
Yeah, nice to see you, sir.
You'd rather collect all the
yeah,
questions?
should we do
Okay,
that?
I'll answer them all.
Pratish Dubey, wonderful to have seen you yesterday, and again thank you for letting me
Thank
know
you.
this opportunity. Thank you to Modern Review for giving me the chance to be here. Sir, firstly I want to thank you for all that you have done for NRIs to get the PIO and PCI card, and just wanted to request if we could take this further and ensure that we can also have the Indian passport like many other countries do. I know it's going to be a tough task.
It's been a tough
but
one,
it's
yeah.
the right person. You're the right person who could lead on this. And my question to you is, if your father had been alive today, in the beginning, Kapil very eloquently spelled out your CV, what would he have said to you?
Right, one more question over there. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Siddharth. I'm a student at King's. My question to you is, in your talk you had said about the upcoming presidential elections could be a template for future possibilities. Now, speaking about INC and the CPIM, at the center they're on the same team, but when it comes to Kerala, I'm from Kerala as well, they are like totally different on almost everything. So what is your take on that? What's your view on how these two parties can come together to make India India again?
Okay.
Madam, final question. Yes,
My
please.
name is Geeta Mohan. I work in the technology area. My question is, Kerala has always been known for the communal harmony. Everybody works, lives so well together. In the backdrop of what is going on today, will this continue in the next few years? And second question, addendum to that, how do you see the progress in the next few years in Kerala, and what will its state be
Right.
in India?
Right. Do you remember all of that?
I think so, yes.
Five
We'll
really
try.
related questions.
So Sri Lanka, I must say that we are definitely in a good position to get back into the good books of Sri Lanka, which had been somewhat lost during the two Rajapaksa administrations, and also because of the Chinese coming in with all sorts of grandiose promises, which now the Sri Lankans realize have done more harm than good. The level of debt Sri Lanka got into, which India had warned against, and of course the fact that they had to essentially surrender Hambantota to the Chinese, and because that was the only way they could avoid having to service the debt and so on. And now there are other financial problems. I think Sri Lanka is going to be much more receptive now to active Indian involvement and cooperation. India is willing to extend it. India flew over tons of relief goods, fuel, petrol, all sorts of things. Sri Lankan airlines are refueling in Thiruvananthapuram and Mumbai and Chennai because there's not enough fuel available in Colombo. All of these things are happening right now. There's now talk of possibly electricity, cables being laid under the sea for Sri Lanka to get electricity from India. There's all sorts of things being talked about. And I think India should do this. I mean, India, in many ways, is the natural partner for Sri Lanka, and I feel reasonably optimistic that this is likely to happen, Professor.
What money powers?
Money power in our politics is very much with the ruling party, and ironically it was with them when they weren't yet the ruling party as well. Partially because a couple of the major corporates decided that Mr. Modi had the friendliest approach to them, and they came in with a very substantial and serious amount of money. Partially because the BJP's late finance minister came up with a rather brilliant scheme called the electoral bonds, where anybody, companies and others, can anonymously donate vast sums of money, but only to registered political parties and not to individual candidates. So what happens is that, and it's anonymous, no one knows who's given what to whom, with the result that the arms can be twisted of large numbers of corporates to buy these electoral bonds and then hand them over to the ruling party. And now there is some sort of watermarking that enables the bonds' authenticity to be checked, which also enables people to know where the bonds have gone, and there are reliable estimates that about 97% of all electoral bonds have gone to one party, the BJP. So these things have all essentially meant that there's an enormous amount of money available to the ruling party to do with it as it wishes. And I'm sorry to say that that this is something we are facing and have been facing already in the last couple of elections. In 2019, I would say in Kerala, in my constituency, and Kerala is a place where the BJP by and large is not strong, we'll come to that in a minute, they probably outspent all the other parties put together. Right. So happened they still lost, but they have the money. On your questions, I know you had two. One about my father, I wouldn't presume to answer, but I hope I've made him proud of me if he's still paying attention. But we lost him sadly 29 years ago, so it's been a long thing. But he was the biggest influence on my life and my biggest sort of hero. So I certainly am consciously and subconsciously striving to be worthy of him. What was the first part of your question?
To work for the Indian citizenship, getting the Indian dual citizenship.
As you probably know, I actually was the first one in these Pravasi Bharatiya summits when I was myself an NRI to call for the permission for dual citizenship, even though I myself had never exercised the option that I have by virtue of birth here of claiming the passport, and I've remained an Indian citizen all my life. Nonetheless, I thought there were too many people who were being forced by circumstance to take foreign passports, but who at heart were really still Indian, and they shouldn't be deprived of the right to have both. But there was no support, and even when I became a minister in the government, I couldn't push this idea, which I've returned to subsequently as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and even there I couldn't get traction. Because all the parties seem united on the conviction that you cannot be loyal to two sovereigns. I remember a minister rather emotionally saying to me when we were in power, if God Save the Queen is played, will he stand up for that or will he stand up for Janagana Mana? How can he have both passports? And that's the sort of emotional thinking which has come into this. And so I'm afraid we're looking at very, very strong and possibly intractable resistance to the idea of dual citizenship. My views have not changed. I'm happy to keep plugging away, but I haven't succeeded so far. There were two questions here on Kerala. Kerala, in many ways, as far as the CPM and the Congress are concerned, in Kerala there is a strong history. I mean, the CPM rose in opposition to the Congress, and the Congress thrived in opposition to the CPM. And so the two of them have been at loggerheads for a very long time. Now, there is a new wrinkle, a new complication, which is the rise of the BJP, which both are opposed to. In Kerala, the BJP has gone from being a 2% party to being a 14 to 16% party. So that's not a small thing. And there are strong, in fact, we have more RSS shakhas per head of population in Kerala than in any state in India. So there is a core that's rather passionately committed, and they have engaged in violence against the CPM as well. So the Congress is caught in a bit of a cleft stick. We want the CPM as a political ally in Delhi, where we agree on things like the menace of the BJP and the menace of the threats to secularism and to intercommunal relations. But in Kerala, they have historically been our strongest rivals, and the two parties and their workers are so bitterly hostile to each other that the idea of cooperating in Kerala seems unthinkable to both. So that's really what happens. I mean, it's not that it's totally impossible, because I have no doubt that I couldn't have won the 3 elections I have without some otherwise communist inclined voters voting for me, and perhaps even some BJP inclined voters voting for me. So I believe it is possible to appeal beyond these primordial passions, but at the moment I would say it seems to me not terribly likely. About Kerala, in terms of its own development and prosperity, the truth is that we are excessively dependent on just 3 or 4 principal sources of revenue. If you look at the Kerala state budget, 75% comes from just three sources of revenue: remittances, excise duty on alcohol, and tourism. I mean, people coming in and staying in our hotels and enjoying our beaches and getting Ayurvedic massages and so on. Now, all of these are very vulnerable. Anytime the Gulf countries decide to shut down and send off their migrant workers, largely because their own young populations are growing up and will actually need work soon, we are in very serious trouble, because not only will we lose a significant source of revenue, we also have no place to accommodate these returnees. We have no jobs for them in our present economy. Secondly, tourism, as we saw during COVID, can be suddenly shut down when you have something like a major pandemic. And when it comes to alcohol, well, I don't need to preach to anybody. I enjoy a good drink once in a while myself, but this is not shall we say, a substantial basis for significant state revenues as it is in Kerala. So we have a fundamental problem. The state is technically, chronically bankrupt. By September or October, it's borrowing money to pay its government salaries. And yet, of course, the profligacy of successive governments with handouts, welfare freebies of various sorts, have meant that we're digging a bigger and bigger and bigger hole in terms of debt. So it's potentially calamitous. Ironically, we have the best human development indicators in India. We have everything, and in fact, it's comparable to the US. As I pointed out in my book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, which is now 25 years ago, all the indicators were almost identical to the US, and some were better. So you got, the number of doctors per head of population, number of nurses per head of population, number of hospital beds per 100,000, literacy rate, education rate, life expectancy, maternal mortality, all like the US. Number of newspapers per head of population higher in Kerala. That was how it was. So and those things have not substantially changed. So all this is good news, but it's basically been built on an unsustainable level of income limit. And I do worry about whether we can sustain that indefinitely. I think we need to have a Kerala that is more business friendly. We are heavily into workers' rights. We have the highest minimum wage in India. We have the strongest and most powerful unions. Kerala has had the most astonishing phenomenon called Nokukuri, which is if you unload a truck yourself to move your own furniture into your home, you have to pay the local communist union for standing there and watching you do it, because it's their right to do what you are doing. That's called Nokukuri, and it's officially, there's been a court judgment against it, but no one can enforce it, because to begin with, the communists control the police, they're running the government. So these things continue to happen. I mean, Kerala has been quite extraordinary in that regard. We'll have to change. We'll have to be far more receptive to business, to investment. Having tried myself during my brief stint in the private sector to encourage even expatriate Keralites to come and invest in Kerala, I can tell you it's a very uphill challenge, because no one believes that Kerala is a hospitable environment to invest. So we have some major challenges. But I think Kerala is ready for a change. I mean, the number of people urging me to give up national politics and focus on Kerala is because they want a new approach. And there is that focus, that yearning for change in the state.
My added question was on the communal harmony, because it's
Yeah,
beautiful now.
the BJP is rising to some degree, but I think it may have already reached its ceiling. We'll have to see. I mean, there's no question when an insidious poison is being spread about a particular kind of messaging. Two things are possible. I'm not a sociologist, but there is suddenly things become permissible to think. Things become permissible to say that in the past you wouldn't admit consciously into your intellectual framework. So suddenly you're seeing other people saying it. Maybe you're seeing them saying it in North India, and you say, well, why can't I say it here? These Muslims are like that, and this history was like that. So now the irony is Kerala had a very different history. Islam didn't come to us with the sword. It came to us through Arab travelers who've been coming for hundreds of years before Islam. And they're the ones who brought the news of the Prophet and so on. And a local Kerala Raja was so interested in the Prophet's message, he went off to meet the Prophet while he was alive. And the evidence for this can be found in Kerala coconut trees growing in Salala near Oman, which he had taken over there. I mean, he had taken the seeds and planted them there. And they're not native to the Arab Peninsula. We have the oldest mosque outside the Arabian Peninsula in Kerala. So you've got all of this stuff going on, and the history of relations is very different from what they were. The chip on the shoulder that the Hindutva movement is able to exploit in North India, the people's historic memories and so on, that kind of chip on the shoulder, there's no reason for it to exist in the South. But we'll have to see. I mean, there is every risk, I'm afraid, every risk that some of this may grow. I still don't believe that it's capable of reaching the level that it has in the North. And so far, as you know, the BJP has failed to win a single seat in Parliament. It briefly won one seat in the State Assembly and promptly lost it again in the next election. So it has no State Assembly seat currently and no National Parliament seat from Kerala. Even though there are some BJP leaders, quote unquote, from Kerala, they are appointed to the Rajya Sabha from other states. And that, at the moment, I think is likely to be the foreseeable future, because even in the sort of rising desire for a change, one doesn't see any clamor for the BJP to be that change. There's too much about them that's beyond the pale for the average Keralite voter.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Yes. Dr. Tharoor's most recent book is available to purchase there. and he will happily sign them for you if you would like to get the book. And do you want to sit here, and then those who want to get the book signed can come and get it signed here. Thank you so much, and hope you all enjoyed it. All right, I'll let you sign.